So thank you all for being here, although I know you're here for the breakfast now, which was truly amazing. So I grew up in the Boston area. That's why my father is here as well. He's the connection to Jeff, so thank you, Dad, and thank you, Jeff, for your interest. I have worked in the humanitarian, democracy, and governance space for about 14 years and have worked both overseas and domestically. I did my grad degree in international development studies at George Washington University in 2011 through night school. And through that, one of the requirements for getting your degree was to learn a lesser known language. And so I was awarded a Bourne Fellowship through the Department of Defense, and I learned Swahili. And I got to go to Tanzania and spend a year there. And while I was there, I started working for the International Rescue Committee, which is a refugee organization. And that really turned me on. I knew I wanted to do international development work, but that really turned me on to the commitment to refugee work, humanitarian work. I did that for about 6 years. And I realized that most conflicts around the world are protracted. They are, especially with refugees. Refugees end up spending 25, 30 years in camps. And it was very difficult to not have a more proactive approach for me after 6 years of solving the problem. And instead, responding with all the critical things of food and health and protection, but not being a part of proactiveness to prevent the crises from starting from the beginning. So I transitioned in 2020 to democracy work. Democracy and governance is the way to prevent, in my opinion, refugee crises. And recently, so I'll dig into this a little in a moment, but recently in 2025, we lost funding for democracy work. And I just so happened to work for a great company who went from 500 to 25 because of the loss of funding, but who was willing to recreate. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about democracy through 3 lenses. I'm going to give you a snapshot of what democracy looks like in the world. I'm going to talk about one of our pivots or initiatives related to democracy in this new world we're living in without US funding for democracy. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about Kosovo's democracy. And I'll explain why Kosovo. And I promise I'll also show it on a map. So those are the 3 lenses of democracy today. This here is a photo. So Democracy Journeys is one of our initiatives. And what it does is it connects Americans and others to the democratic stories around the world through 5 to 8 day trips to different countries. These are small group trips, elevated travel. This here is a photo at Lake Ohrid. This is the St. John at Caneo Church, 15th century church on Lake Ohrid. Lake Ohrid is a lake in southern North Macedonia, and it is a UNESCO protected site. It's totally beautiful. One of the stops on our Western Balkans tour. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next slide. So again, democracy through 3 lenses: state of democracy in the world, democracy journeys, and then Kosovo. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the company that I worked for and still work for over the past 3 years and its pivot. So in 2022, I started working for a company called Democracy International. Now, Democracy International was founded in 2003 by 2 American democracy experts, Glenn Cowan and Eric Bjornlund. In over 22 years, they built an organization of 2 to about 500. We had 100 at our home office and about 418 different field offices at a time. Over those 23 years, Democracy International implemented more than 100 democracy projects around the world in 88 different countries, primarily on behalf of the US government. So that was USAID and the US State Department. Now you might ask, although I have heard from this group that many of you already know, what are democracy programs? What does that entail? And why was the US government doing it? why was the US government investing money in other people's democracies or in promoting democracies in other countries? So what is democracy program? So this is one example of democracy programming. It is election observation. Why did the US do election observation? Because it is proven that if other countries are observing your elections, so for the US, we're observing other people's elections. If other countries observe those elections, they are more likely to be free and fair. You tend to play by the rules when people are watching. And when the United States is watching as a democracy leader around the world, it makes a difference. So one type of democracy programming that the US engaged in, this is 2014 in Egypt. Another form of democracy programming that the US engaged in is building state and local governance. So working with mayors and governors to improve their democratic practices. And this is especially critical in young democracies. Why? Because they are just learning, often first generation, how to run a democratic form of government, what it means to engage citizens, what it means to be transparent. And so this here is a photo from Kosovo. Kosovo's democracy is 17 years old. Before that, they lived under communism and under Ottoman rule for hundreds of years. And this was a Democracy International program where we worked with 15 mayors to use their discretionary funding as their citizens wanted. So to actively engage their citizens, their constituents, on we have €1 million, how do you want to see that used? What projects do you want to see done in your city? And this here was a joint initiative, a brainstorm with citizens to rehabilitate a public park, and they're cutting a ribbon to initiate that rehabilitation. So another Democracy International project. Now, third type of democracy programming is ensuring that citizens have access to justice and that their human rights are respected. This is a Democracy International program on behalf of the US government and Bangladesh. And part of what we were doing was educating underprivileged groups on what access to justice they had, what was available to them, what was an infraction that they should take seriously, and then the resources to address it. And oftentimes, in many countries, women fall under underprivileged groups because they don't have the same level of connection or social capital as men. So this is a community women's session where a Bangladeshi woman that worked with us was explaining, working with them to understand their access to justice. Now, much of the work that Democracy International did required working very closely with high-profile individuals in the countries that we were engaging with. Countries needed to buy in to the democracy work being done in their country. So this is 2004. This is Eric Bjornlund, one of our founders. He through Democracy International, was working alongside the Carter Center to observe the Indonesian national elections. This is him giving a press conference to national and international press on the outcomes of those elections, and then later meeting with the president-elect, same day, I noticed because same tie, the president-elect of Indonesia to talk about the importance of free and fair elections. And this here is Glenn Cowan, our other founder in 2014. And I'm curious if anyone knows who this is. It's a hard one. So this is Dr. Abdullah, and he ended up becoming the equivalent of the president of Afghanistan. And in 2014, he was one of the presidential candidates for the 2014 elections. And Glenn was meeting with him to discuss the electoral reform work that Democracy International was doing to prepare Afghanistan for their national elections. Okay, so that's Democracy International. That's where I work, and that's some of the work that we did for 2 decades on behalf of the US government. So now the state of democracy in the world. Okay, in 2004, 51% of the world population lived in democracies. In 2024, 28% of the world population lives in democracies. In addition, in 2024, it was the first time in 20 years that there are more autocracies around the world than democracies. And this here is a study out of an institution called VDEM. It's an institution in Sweden. Our equivalent in the US is Freedom House. Freedom House has a democracy in the World Report they release every year. And a few years ago, the VDEM report was widely considered in the democracy community to be methodologically slightly stronger than Freedom House. But they are both very credible and have very strong methodologies in how they qualify democracies versus autocracies. Now, autocracies is an umbrella term for non-democracies. It could be a dictatorship or authoritarianism or communism, anything where people don't have the right to vote, or that their vote doesn't count, or that freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, civil freedoms are not respected. So a massive drop between 2020 and 2024. And part of that is population of larger countries like India that have switched towards autocracy. And part of it is just the number of countries. Again, 91 autocracies in 2024 to 88 democracies. First time in 20 years that there are more autocracies in the world than democracies. And so you might think that this would be a wake-up call to the United States to double down on its democracy work, to increase its engagement in promoting democracy and freedom around the world. But as many of you know, in 2025, our administration cuts all democracy work, not just through USAID, but also through the State Department. And actually, just this week, the administration released a new national security policy that explicitly states that we do not care about other people's democracy. We care about making deals. We care about the trade opportunities, and we are not going to hold people's feet to the fire in terms of how they treat their citizens or their level of democracy. And so what this means is we're no longer observing elections. We as Americans are no longer observing elections overseas. We're no longer engaging with state and local government. We're no longer promoting rule of law. As some of us know very personally, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. And that last point is that we're no longer requiring basic standards of democracy or human rights to do business with countries or to offer investment to countries. And you might think, well, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should allow other countries to and their citizens to figure it out. Why are we spending money on other people's democratic states or lack thereof? And there's a values argument there. It aligns with our values as Americans to believe in freedom and to believe in human rights. And we should engage. Those values should extend beyond our democracy. But I wanted to give you just 3 other arguments briefly as to why we should invest in other countries' democracies. So one is economic. Democratic countries have more stable markets and economies and are better for trade for the US and for US companies to invest in. Geopolitically, collective action among democratic countries is significant in countering autocracy. We as Americans believe, or we have been told, that Russia and China and North Korea are threats. And the more democratic countries we have around the world, the easier as a collective, people that share the same values, we have to respond to autocracies and strongman governments. And a great example of that is Ukraine. When Russia invaded Ukraine's sovereign territory, it went to knock on the doors of Western countries, and the door was already open. Democracy, democracy. They invaded your sovereign territory. We're here to help, at least at first. And that is an example of the collective action of democracy. There's also a security component. We are safer as Americans traveling to democracies than autocracies. And I think we often as Americans go to democracies. So as US travelers, it is our security is more protected in democracies, but more so than that, the security of our world is more protected with democracies. Democratic countries tend to respect the sovereign borders of other countries, and that helps create a more peaceful world. And democratic countries don't feel a need to build a nuclear program often because they rely on the joint security of other democratic countries. Autocratic countries, that is not the case. They do not have that collective security or support. So it makes our world safer. So moving to the second lens, when the administration canceled all democracy programs this year, our company, Democracy International, had to figure out what we were going to do. We primarily implemented Department of State and USAID programs, and they disappeared. So we went from about 500 people to 25. And we really had to think what our assets were, what we brought to the table, and what we could still offer democracy around the world, as well as what we could offer democracy at home, because it became clear to us that our skills in building and defending democracies were also important in this moment in the United States. And so we came up with 4 initiatives, and I'm here to talk about one, Democracy Journeys. And one asset we realized that we have that very few companies or organizations or entities have is an incredible network of democracy leaders around the world. Again, we've worked in over 88 countries. We've worked with our equivalents of Supreme Court justices, of members of Congress, of journalists, activists, and community leaders. We have worked alongside them in their democracies and have really great relationships. And that's unique. No one really has that level of access to democratic leaders in so many countries around the world. And the other thing is that we have run delegations for years, delegations of parliamentarians from Malawi or from Bangladesh to the United States. And so we also know how to curate an experience of knowledge exchange and engagement. And so we decided to design small group travel for Americans and others to immerse themselves in another country's democracy and hear stories from those democratic leaders in other countries. And our hypothesis is that if Americans and others had the opportunity to travel overseas and meet with other countries' democratic leaders, then both those who traveled and those leaders who told their stories would walk away with a level of hope and encouragement and inspiration from the inquisitive travelers who have their own narratives and experiences and those who are sharing their democratic stories in those sessions. And then the second part of our hypothesis is that if we planned these 8-day excursions with these local leaders, these people with incredible access, that they will help create an itinerary that is truly immersive and exclusive and is often sought after but hard to find in the tourism sector. So those were our 2 hypotheses, and we had our first trip in October to Kosovo and North Macedonia, and we were really thrilled that both of those hypotheses came true. And one of the best parts for me, in addition to the great wine and great food and great camaraderie and great conversation, and the wine, did I say the wine? The wine was very good, is that Adita, one of the women we meet with, she was the deputy prime minister for Kosovo, and she was the lead negotiator in normalizing relations with Serbia. She's a big deal. And she said after our lunch with her, where she told her story, she had never told her story. No one had ever asked her to speak about her personal story. People had asked her to speak about geopolitics in the Balkans and democracy, but her story going through Kosovo war, independence, democracy building, normalizing relations, from her perspective, her story, no one had told her. And that meant the world to us, that it was as rewarding for her as it was for all of us who had the privilege of hearing her story. And so in terms of where we go to countries that are either new democracies or are countries who have experienced threats to their democracies. And the reason we do that is both of those places in the democratic journey are just very alive and very dimensional and interesting, and meet us in our moment as Americans as being more inquisitive about our own democracy and how to protect it. So you might want to know where we go, what our trips are, what countries fall into these categories. And so very briefly, these are our tours in 2026. So Armenia became a democracy in the early 1990s, but in 2018, they had a peaceful nonviolence movement to prevent their president from seeking a third and illegal term. And we meet with the people that helped orchestrate that resistance movement. And today they have their next election in 2026, and we'll be there right after. So we also engage with activists and political leaders who are very enmeshed in the ongoing, they are a young democracy, their ongoing trajectory of democracy. Kosovo and North Macedonia, two young democracies coming out of Yugoslavia, and we cover their democratic arc with the primary democratic leaders that have led them through the ups and have stood by through the downs to try to defend their democracies. Albania was a North Korea until 1991. It was a closed communist country. You could not enter, and you really couldn't exit. And they are now the top contender for EU ascension, for EU membership, slated for 2030, which requires you to have incredibly open markets and a strong economy, but also democratic tenets. So we meet with two former prime ministers there, journalists and activists, to learn how they transition their country so quickly to being a strong democracy, but also what is remaining to be done, which is significant. Mexico, we tell the story of intergenerational resistance through food and art. In Washington, D.C., we analyze our own democracy with political theorists, members of Congress, journalists. NPR is also part of it. I guess that falls under journalism. It's a shorter trip, a 4-day trip, where we analyze our country and what we can do to support our democracy. Okay, so I want to tell briefly the story of Kosovo. And the reason I want to tell it is that Kosovo is a great example of how the United States foreign democratic policy can make a significant and positive difference when it comes to a country's democracy. And I also want to tell it for you to get a sense of some of the stories that you would hear on one of our journeys. So before I go to the next slide, I am curious, how many of you know where Kosovo is by show of hands? That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Can anyone name an adjacent country to Kosovo? Or give it a try?
Serbia.
Okay, excellent. So here is Kosovo. It's that red country down here, and we also go to North Macedonia, which is the country immediately below it. Serbia and Kosovo are in the center of the Balkans. And you probably have traveled or have heard of folks traveling to Croatia or Greece or Italy or Turkey. It is right in the middle of those countries. It is a totally beautiful country. I think my dad mentioned they have great mountains, they have great culture, great food. And Albania, immediately to its left, has recently become a cheaper Italy. It's where people are going now for their vacations. We have a trip there as well. But I think Kosovo and North Macedonia are just getting on the map as really interesting places to travel to. Now, Kosovo and North Macedonia were part of former Yugoslavia. And the reason I wanted to briefly show you this map is because in 1913, Albania got its independence. Albania was never part of Yugoslavia. 1913, Treaty of London, it got its independence. However, it didn't draw its own border. They never do. And 90% of the region of Kosovo, so that outline of Kosovo, 90% of it was ethnic Albanian. And 30% of what is now North Macedonia, 35%, was ethnically Albanian. So if Albania had the opportunity to claim the territory where it had a majority ethnic presence, it would include the border of Kosovo and a slice of North Macedonia. But it didn't. And so Kosovo and North Macedonia became part of Yugoslavia. And it actually, for Kosovars, for ethnic Albanian Kosovars, it wasn't so bad. They often refer to Tito as being kind of a benevolent dictator and supporting Yugoslavia in significant ways, North Macedonians as well, during his rule. And one thing that he did during his rule is he gave, all of these are republics. Kosovo was part of the Republic of Serbia, is that he gave the Kosovo region of the Republic of Serbia autonomy. And so they had their own government, an Albanian elected government. They taught Albanian in schools. They had their own local economy. They paid tax to Yugoslavia. They were able to maintain their ethnic identity. In the late 1980s, Milosevic came into power. Tito died, Milosevic came into power, and he was highly nationalistic and Serb. And he wanted, because Kosovo was part of the Serbian Republic, he wanted Serbs to control the Kosovo region, the government, the economy, and wasn't really interested in Albanians playing a role in that region. And so in 1989, he sent military and police into the region of Kosovo and displaced the government, threw people out of their jobs based on their ethnicity, and closed down Albanian schools. And now this man here, Ibrahim Rugova, the gentleman sitting with President Clinton, he was the head of the government at the time, ethnic Albanian, and he led Kosovo Albanians in their response. So initially they had a referendum. They voted overwhelmingly, the region voted for independence, and Serbia said, no thanks, we don't recognize that. You can't have a referendum, you're part of us. It's not, no thank you. And so under Ibrahim Rugova's leadership, Kosovo Albanians responded with this incredible shadow government and nonviolent resistance. Shadow government in the sense that they set up an informal tax system, that they had political leaders underground, that they set up Albanian schools in homes with the shades drawn, and they created a parallel health system, which was especially important because Albanians were not treated well in Serb-run hospitals, especially pregnant women. And so having safe private health facilities was critical. And that informal tax system they set up helped fund the teachers, the doctors, et cetera. And we actually, our tour guide for our trip to Kosovo, so we have local tour guides for all of our countries who are democratic leaders of that country. She served as Secretary General of the Free State of Kosovo, of the Ministry of Local Governance, and the Ministry of Defense, so two different posts, the highest civilian position post-Kosovo's independence. And she happened to work with us on a Democracy International project. And so she leads our time in Kosovo, and she's incredible. But she was 6 at the time in 1989 when the Serbs came in and took over the region. And she remembers walking to school one day and practicing her alphabet, walking to school, and there being Serb police outside her school saying, this school is closed. You need to go home, out of nowhere. And she returned home, and her mom, who was fully employed, was home. And her mom had been dismissed that day from her job, same day that Rosafa's school was closed. And in the coming weeks, it was her cousins, her father, her neighbors. Hundreds of thousands of Albanians had this experience. Now, this woman here is a former president of Kosovo. She was president from 2011 to 2014, first female president of the Balkans. And she welcomed us into Kosovo's parliament on our tour and told her story. And part of her story really started when she was in school at the same time, 1989, and she remembers putting books, the Albanian textbooks, under her shirt and wearing extra coats so that Serb police wouldn't stop her and her brother on the street as they would, and they would beat kids that they found with books. And her brother got caught once and were beaten by Serb police, and that is the start of her story in engaging in nonviolent resistance in Kosovo. Now, there was a second piece. It was not just nonviolent resistance in country, but Ibrahim Rugova believed that if he went to Western democratic countries, this goes back to this collective action idea, and he told the story of Kosovo and their democratic attempts to resist the Serbs, that perhaps democratic countries would come to their aid. So of course he's here with President Lincoln, or sorry, not President Lincoln, President Clinton. They kind of sound similar, in the late 1990s. But from '89 through the late 1990s, dozens of times he traveled to the US and to Europe. And this woman down here, Adita Tahiri, I mentioned her a little bit earlier. She was kind of second in charge in the Albanian political party, the League of Democratic Kosovos, with Ibrahim Rugova. And she tells a story when we meet with her for lunch that she knew when she was in the US Capitol trying to meet with senators and congressmen to tell the story of Kosovo, that she would have 2 minutes. She knew that the delegate from Germany would have 20, the delegate from Nigeria would have 15, but she would have 2 because Kosovo was not generally known. And so she had to try to change people's opinion and get them to invest in Kosovo in 2 minutes. And that was their second strategy to save Kosovo, its ethnic identity, and to save Albanians from the repression they were under. Through the 1990s, the repression continued. In the late 1990s, there were credible reports of ethnic cleansing. Another really important historical thing happened in the mid-1990s that helped push Western countries over the edge to support Kosovo, and that is 2 significant genocides between 1991 and 1994. Any guesses on Bosnia being one? 94, 95, Africa, Rwanda being the other. And President Clinton has said publicly that he regrets not acting more assertively with those 2 genocides. And this is right in the middle of Kosovo's resistance and an increasing crackdown on ethnic Albanians. And of course, Bosnia was part of Yugoslavia. That is also Milosevic. That's also part of the Yugoslav story. And so by the end of the 1990s, President Clinton was speaking to the American people and saying it's our moral imperative to intervene in this crisis. In 1998, they attempted peace talks, the Rambouillet talks in France between Serbia and Kosovo. They failed. And during this time, ethnic cleansing was just ramping up. It was 30 people in this village, 25 people in this village, 80 people in this village. And finally, the NATO, in February of 1999, took military action, first concerted NATO action for humanitarian reasons in our history, and bombed Belgrade, military installations primarily in Belgrade for 76 days until Milosevic capitulated. Now, unfortunately, when the US, there's a lot of unfortunate things about this result, but while the US was bombing Belgrade, another woman we meet on our journey, Farija Hoti, was in a village that experienced the anger of Serbs, so that the ethnic cleansing increased during the bombing as a response. And all the men and boys in her village were killed by Serbs. The women were separated. They killed all the men and boys. And so she returned a year later and had to figure out how to rebuild. Now, most women in the countryside of Kosovo were not able or did not culturally work outside the home. They usually had large gardens and provided for the family, but she had to buck tradition and learn to drive. And she started selling her vegetables, pickled vegetables and ivar, which is like a hummus but made with red peppers, to the local community, and then eventually to grocery stores. And today we meet with her at her factory, where she has employed 50 war widows in her town, and they now sell internationally. And so her story is just an incredible story of resistance. Now, this photo here is a UK tank entering into Pristina, and those people are internally displaced persons, IDPs, ethnic Albanians, who are running to greet the tank. So from 1999 through 2008, the US, the EU, and the UN came alongside Kosovo and helped them transition to an independent and democratic country. First elections were in 2001, municipal elections. 70% of people showed up to vote. One of our speakers, former president of Kosovo, was leading the police force, the national police force. They didn't have a military at first. And she had the idea of creating a woman police force contingency. Any sense as to why a woman police force would have been compelling or helpful? Sorry? So yes, there was significant sexual violence during the war. And in general, for over a decade, Serb police had patrolled the streets and had just invoked great fear. And so by putting a woman's face in a police uniform, it helped people more quickly transition to police being a public service and not something to be feared. So one of the feathers in the former president's cap was a women's police force. And then 2008, Kosovo declared its independence. Their National Assembly voted. They took the UN and the US and the EU by surprise. I don't think anyone thought they were quite ready, but they felt like they were ready. And this is a newborn statue in the middle of Kosovo that marks their independence, the middle of Pristina, the capital. And within 24 hours, the US recognized them as a sovereign nation, which is significant. That holds a lot of weight. And now today, 124 countries around the world recognize Kosovo. Now, I was talking with someone a little bit earlier about the importance of continued US support in young democracies. Democracy is a muscle you practice, and the United States continued through 2024 to be a significant partner of Kosovo. I think I put in the brief for today that the US has spent more per capita in Kosovo than anywhere else in the world in terms of support. And a lot of that was to build a democracy from scratch. And you will hear from the taxi driver to the former president in Kosovo how much they appreciate that support. And also their recognition. Everyone we met, the recognition in Kosovo was they knew the only way they'd survive as a small country size of Connecticut, 1.7 million people in the Balkan region, is if they were a democracy and if they were a partner, back to collective action, of the EU and the US. And so even though democracy was not in their fabric, in their makeup, they have become one of the more progressive democracies in Eastern Europe, with the US and EU as a North Star or their model. So you've already heard some of the stories from our trip. I'm just going to tell one more. I'm going to skip the others because I know I want to leave time for questions. This is Father Sava. Father Sava is the abbot of the Dečani Monastery, which is a UNESCO-protected 15th century monastery in northern Kosovo. Ethnic Albanians are largely Muslim, mostly agnostic Muslim, but culturally are Muslim. Serbs are Orthodox Christians. And so part of the reason that Serbia felt compelled to take over the region of Kosovo is they have these incredible churches and religious installations in the region. So 14th century church, he himself is Serb, he's half Serb, half Croatian. And during the Kosovo War, when ethnic cleansing was happening around his monastery, he opened his gates to over 200 Albanians and gave them shelter, preventing them from the Serb forces in the area. And then unfortunately, as often happens in wars, is that when another side is victorious, there are reprisal attacks. So there were certainly Albanian reprisal attacks against Serb communities after the war, and he again opened his gates to Serbs to give them protection. And since then, he has been a very outspoken and a maverick of sorts of opinions, because he firmly believes that the only way to solve conflict in Balkans is through democracy. Because you cannot split people up based on your ethnicity or your nationalistic leanings. It is too intermixed. And so his opinion, which is very different from the Serb opinion, is that Kosovo needs to remain independent in a democracy. So we heard his story over a lot of homemade brandy that they make at the monastery, and his incredible role in the dialogue. And then he gave us a tour of the monastery's library and some 14th century Ottoman documents, but a really compelling story. So I'm going to skip these. I think I mentioned this, but we tend to drink a fair amount of wine on our journeys and eat a lot of good food. And so this here is the boardroom of the Tikvesh winery. It's a 140-year-old winery in North Macedonia. CNN Travel actually this morning released an article about how good the wine is in North Macedonia and how it's like the one country in Europe that has good wine that's not overrun by tourists. So we had a 5-course meal with wine pairing in the middle of our trip to reflect and enjoy. We also, Lake Ohrid in southern North Macedonia, were welcomed by a local chef on her rooftop patio overlooking the lake, and she served us a multi-course meal and homemade wine. And then we ended at organic winery right outside of Skopje, family run, and they also have a local artist do their labels, and heard their story in addition to enjoying really good wine. We do some morning hikes as well. Many of these cities have great fortresses because, of course, they were strategic at the time to defend their cities. We usually hike up to those. We go to the Dechani Monastery. So we also really engage in culture. We do some city tours so that you can really understand the more ancient history, as well as an archaeological dig called Stobi in North Macedonia. So those are our trips. I hope that Kosovo is a good illustration of both U.S. democratic efforts globally, but also just the incredibly rich and dimensional stories that we offer on our journeys. So I will stop there. Sorry, I think I went a little longer than I was supposed to. But I'm curious if there are any questions. Are there time for questions? Yeah. Okay. Any questions about any piece of the presentation?
So, as Kosovo became, worked through independence, what is the situation now between Albanians and Serbs in terms of Kosovo?
It's a great question. So Serbia does not recognize Kosovo or its independence. And Serbia actually, we were hoping for our trip to be Serbia and Kosovo because there always are two sides to every story. But Serbia is going through its own it's struggled with authoritarianism since it became an independent country. But there are significant student-led protests happening in Serbia to fight corruption. There are hunger strikes, there are tens of thousands of people marching, and so a big priority for us is that our trips are very safe, that you never have a question about your safety on our trips. So we ultimately opted to not do Serbia. The hope is that Serbia turns to more democratic values, and then the talks between Serbia and Kosovo can continue in the direction of recognizing each other's independence and sovereignty, but we're far from that. And the U.S. was also playing a significant role in those talks, and is less engaged at the moment. So it's an issue. There's still a great deal of tension, and still two very different opinions on what happened in the 1990s.
Two questions. One's really short. Does Kosovo have any chance of joining the EU? Is it in the EU?
It's not in the EU. It is an aspiration of Kosovo. One, there are 4 tenets for joining the EU, and one is that you get along with your neighbors. It's like a newer tenet, and that your borders are generally recognized, and Kosovo still has a lot of challenges there. So an aspiration, but Kosovo is far from that.
And can you talk a little bit about your Washington, D.C. trip?
Yes.
That's the part we're all involved in now.
Yeah. Wow. So Our Washington, D.C. trip came out of conversations we had like this, where people said, I want to go overseas. That's amazing. I'm really concerned about what's happening here. And we are too. And because of the connections we have in democracy circles in DC, and because DC, of course, is a hot spot for, it's kind of a microcosm of what's happening more broadly, and it's where decisions are made. So it's a 4-day trip. We'll have it up in January. We're still working on the details, but we will take, much like the VDEM report, the statistic I showed, we'll have a political scientist lay out for us where we stand on the various aspects of democracy, and that will kick off our time. And then we'll meet with some law firms, some journalists, some government officials, and NPR fits in there. I have a number of sessions to really understand how people are pushing back against undemocratic efforts by the government, how successful they are, and then we'll have towards the end a reflection as to how we as Americans can best support our democracy. So shorter trip, 4 days. We also, DC has some musical roots, so we explore a jazz bar and dueling pianos in Georgetown, and do a few other cultural events, maybe some go-go, to also bring in the DC cultural components of the trip.
It seems that in order for your program to work as well as it does, it requires a pretty significant buy-in on the parts of the leaders and the dignitaries in the countries that you're visiting. And I'm curious if you have any comments about how you build that credibility, or how, especially going into the engagement, you convince your target hosts to that it's a win-win.
Yeah.
For the amount of effort and time that they're putting into.
Yeah. Oh, I love that question. So we have very deep relationships in all of these countries because of the work we've done there. Or if we haven't done work there, we have very deep relationships with people who have led democracy work there. And that gives us access. So in Kosovo, we had a project from 2020 to 2025, and we were engaging with municipal government. But because of the people who worked on our project, they worked in national government. They worked with journalists. And so we have that deep connection. And that's really what our value add is. That was when we sat down and we said, what do we do? 25 of us sat down. We realized that those connections are unique to our company based on our work. So that's one. The second is that we compensate everyone that we meet with. Now, most people at this point are not interested in a speaker fee, but they're interested in us supporting their foundation. And frankly, some of the journalists we meet with are wanting to be on our website because it shows to their government that a US organization knows them and is tracking them. And so in North Macedonia, for instance, it is in a dip in its democracy arc, and the US plays a significant role in has as a watchdog. We watch, we observe, and we know people who are fighting for human rights. And so there's an affiliation, even though we are not the US government, we are a US organization that is accustomed to shining spotlights on people who need protection. So I think there's a little bit of that as well. And then there's also the sense, it's a fortunately and unfortunately kind of statement, where fortunately we have outsized power in the world as Americans. Unfortunately, we have outsized power in the world as Americans. And so having Americans who are intellectuals, or who have done rule of law work, or who are coming on these trips and are interested has more weight than if we were from another country. And there is a hope, I believe, that this is a blip in US support, and that this is a good way for them to continue building relationships with Americans, like soft diplomacy, while the government is not investing in it.
Curious about Ethiopia. Have you done any work with Ethiopia or Tigray?
Very briefly in 2020, we worked on some inter-ethnic peace building work. This is at a previous organization that I worked at, but not under Democracy International, or not since I've been there. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that this was one of 4 programs that you're focusing on. What were the other 3?
Yeah, so we have a nonprofit spinoff going back to human rights, where we are an organizing group for all of the people in DC who have worked to defend human rights defenders around the world. So the US government probably had 150 people working on that who are so steeped and intelligent when it comes to how to best protect and equip human rights defenders around the world, and they all lost their jobs. And so we are a volunteer corps through a nonprofit where they're giving their hours to continue to support human rights defenders around the world. And we hope that there will be some foundational funding for that so that we can pay them for their continued support. So that's a second. A third is that we started engaging in management consulting at the state and local level of US government on things, elections and democracy work. And that is, as you know, someone mentioned last night at another talk, oh, you could partner with the town of Sudbury so that they can have online voting in their town meetings. It's so annoying that there's not just a button you press. And that's literally some of the work that we have done overseas, is how do we make it easier for citizens to participate in the decisions of their local state. And so it's even things along those lines. And then our third is we're still applying to international funding, primarily EU funding for democracy work. So those are 4.
So how is the organization funded? You've got your private. So given that you've been slashed.
The uncomplicated answer is that because we were a company and 5% of our business over the past 20 years is for profit, we have enough money to make a pivot. But we need our four channels, our 4 efforts to bear fruit.
Elizabeth, these tours,
Yeah.
Your father obviously went on one.
Yes.
So they're open to anybody, obviously.
No,
And
Greg,
so-
you need money.
And so how does, if they are in fact open to the public,
They are.
how does someone sign up, and when does someone sign up? Because these are all small tours, small groups.
They are.
So I assume they fill up pretty fast. How would someone like us, how would we get on a tour?
Yes.
And by the way, if those of you that are willing, please put your name and email down, because that's how Elizabeth can follow through with.
Yeah, it's a great question. So all these tours are on our website, and you can register directly on our website. So that's one way to sign up.
Your website is?
democracyjourneys.com. And actually, over here, we have little postcards that have QR codes. They also have the website listed, so an easy way to get to our website. And then we are a very intimate group. We are 5 people working on this initiative, and any time of week, we are happy to talk to you about your interests on a tour. Happy to talk about. We also will add additional tours if tours fill up, because we're able to add that. So they are available. Yeah.
So this has been tremendous, and it's great you do this work. What do you see yourself doing in 2, 3, 5 years? You gonna run for office or something?
They're looking at the next president.
We're looking for one.
I'm going to be doing visitations to memory care units for.
You know, I have loved the work I've done for the past 15 years, from refugee work to democracy work. And I have to say, I really love the company I'm at now. It's just a lot of smart, thoughtful, and kind people. And it's been great to go through this difficult year with them and to come up with these great new initiatives. And so I hope that these initiatives are robust and we do them a few years from now. I'd love to be a part of that. And I hope that the government re-engages in democracy around the world and that I get to continue to do that incredible work of engaging with Kenyans, with Tanzanians, with Jamaicans, all people that I've loved working with on their freedoms and their democracy. That's my hope.
Just a philosophical question.
Ooh, okay.
Oppression. Like, do you think, when you mentioned voices as part of democracy, like I try to do, as a social worker, I do anti-oppression work, and I'm curious for your thoughts about like whether it's more effective to work from the leaders down or to lift the voices of the people in the community.
It's a great question. Oftentimes, in my opinion, leaders are pro the idea of democracy, but are not necessarily pro the implementation of democracy. And so getting the leaders' blessings, like a country to agree to do an electoral reform project or a citizen engagement project, is to me a checkbox, and then it's working with people. So for me, it is more grassroots up, because the benefit there is then when constituents are asking for something and when people want to be elected, if enough constituents are asking for the right thing or for the democratic thing, then that is where politicians really get behind it. And so I think young democracies is a little bit different because there are a lot of idealistic leaders in young democracies. And so then working at more of the national level, or as we did in Kosovo with mayors, there's a lot of very good work that can be done and a lot of energy around democracy. But generally, I find it's better to get the blessing and then work with people.
So even if the leaders are kind of doing the oppression and trying to like kind of negotiate with them to get them to open their mind, expand their minds, and then it's awesome.
Yeah, I think that a lot of countries, there are ideals and there's reality. And I think it's the people that help move the reality towards the ideals. It's often very hard for leaders to change the very practiced muscle of clientelism or corruption, because it's so embedded. And so they need the people's movement to really make change. Yeah.
Yes, that was great.
Thank you. Thank you very much.